moving on, last presentation of the morning. This is a case study, the S in Snowy 2.0. So just a couple of things on that. In 2018, the Australian government and Snowy Hydro embarked on a significant renewable energy project. It was seen as clean, green and economically feasible. And whilst financial, environmental and construction risks were front of mind, some of the real big challenges came from stakeholders, communities, shareholders and the social licence. So if you don't get the S right, you put everything at risk. Please join me in welcoming Praveena Karunaharan to present. She's a seasoned GRC executive and a board member with a real passion for social impact and sustainability. Recently relocated to New Zealand from Sydney, where she was the Chief Risk and Governance Officer at Snowy Hydro, which is Australia's largest renewable energy company. An ESG advocate and a non-executive director of several not-for-profits in the education and social sectors. Please join me in welcoming Praveena.
Thank you. Morning, everyone. Great to be here. Look, it's not often you see this many people who want to talk about risk at 8 o'clock in the morning. So thank you, Kerry, for bringing this forum together and KPMG guys for your space. David, completely agree with you. I think that interplay between risk and strategy is so crucial. I think for so long, risk professionals were seen as people who act as roadblocks, right? Or guardians or police officers. Our role is to stop people taking risks. That's not true. Our role is to help people understand what the risk is and whether the upside outweighs the cost. So it's fantastic to see, I think, more and more risk having that voice. And I'm preaching to the converted, but I think the more we can be at the table when those strategy conversations are happening, the more we can make sure that the right risks are being taken at the right time. So a little bit of background about me, as you've heard, and as you can probably hear in my voice, I'm Australian. I was born in Sri Lanka, but spent the last 30 years of my life in Sydney. I started my career in professional services. I was a director in PwC's consulting practice back before PwC became a dirty word in Australia. And in 2014, I decided to make the move into the renewable energy sector. So Australia was starting to go through a real transition when it came to energy. We had politicians bringing lumps of coal into Parliament and waving it around. But at the same time, we had a large group that really wanted to take advantage of some of our natural resources. So be that solar or wind or water. So I made the move into Snowy Hydro, where I stayed for 9 years and had an amazing time till I relocated to New Zealand. Why New Zealand? I met my Kiwi husband in Sydney 12 years ago, and after a long campaign and some negotiations, he finally convinced me to make the move. So I've been here full time since Christmas. It's a very new Kiwi. And it's interesting, a lot of my friends back in Sydney say, oh, you've just moved from Sydney to Auckland, so it's not that different. Let me tell you, it's very different. It's very different. Two of the things that have really stood out for me, and I'm not going to talk about the weather, and I'm not going to tell you how warm it is in Sydney today, are firstly relationships. So I think in New Zealand, relationships are so much more of a focus. Partly because of size, partly probably because of the culture. And I love that because as someone who's new to the country and new to the business community, people have been so welcoming and so willing to connect me with others. And I really appreciated that. And I think that's a real strength here. The other thing, and an area I think where Australia can learn a lot from New Zealand, is your treatment of the Māori community, the Indigenous people, and the attention and the conversations that are held around social and economic inequity. I think there's no arguing that there's a lot more that could be done, but I think when it comes to relativities, it's an area that Australia is still really struggling with. If you've seen any of the press around, the voice to Parliament, it's a great example of how not to handle an S-related issue, but it's something I'm really looking forward to learning more about as well. So good segue into my story, which is on Snowy 2. How many of you have heard of Snowy Hydro? Fantastic. So Snowy, as you mentioned, is Australia's largest renewable energy company. It has a footprint on the eastern seaboard of Australia. So that's New South Wales, Victoria and South Australia. It provides a little over a third of all renewable energy in the national electricity market. It's predominantly hydro, pumped hydro, 98%. We do have small gas peaking plants, and they're essentially used to fill the gaps when demand is really high and our hydro stations are running at capacity. I still say we, it's been a few months, but I'm still getting used to it. Snowy has offices sort of all across that eastern seaboard, so Sydney, Melbourne, Adelaide, but the heart of the company, sort of the operations and where the real sort of vibrancy lies is in the Snowy Mountains. So our power stations and our dams are all in the Snowy Mountains, often in some very remote communities where Snowy is the main employer. So you'll often come across families where 3 generations all worked for the company in varying roles, and there's some real pride and a sense of living the values when you meet the employees in these communities. We also have a retail brand, Red Energy. Red was actually started by a Kiwi, Ian Graham, and it was owned by Contact Energy before they sold it to Snowy Hydro for $1. Fun fact, that retail business that cost us $1 now contributes $110 million every year in net profit. It's an incredible success story. And so many of that team, that original management team, are still part of Red. Their primary value is decency. And for the last 10 plus years, they have consistently won the CanStar Award for highest customer satisfaction. They're the only utility that made the Roy Morgan Trust Risk Report, which is the most trusted brands in the country. And in fact, they beat out Mercedes-Benz in that report. So it just gives you a bit of a flavour of what sort of business it is. It has over 1 million customers, which in a country the size of Australia still makes it only the 4th largest retailer. We are a commercial company, so Snowy Hydro has always been owned by governments. There was an attempt to privatise it about 20 years ago, and while there was huge interest from the private sector, the public backlash was massive because it's seen as part of, it's an Australian asset, it's ours, we don't want to give it away to private companies. So it's always been owned by multiple governments, but about 5 years ago, it was bought out by the Australian government, and I'll talk a little bit about that shortly. It is still a commercial company corporatised under the Corporations Act. It competes with the private sector on an even footing, and it operates under the principles of competitive neutrality. Has a skills-based board, so 9 directors, 8 of whom are non-executives, and an independent chairman. So from a corporate governance perspective, very similar to probably what many of you have. Boards supported by board committees, all of whom are chaired by non-executive directors, and then the CEO has his own management committees, internal assurance, external assurance, regulators. The nature of the business is such that it has generators, a retail business. It also has a financial services license because it trades in electricity derivatives, futures and options with other retail players. It has a water license. It has environmental requirements, which means it has over 65 regulators scrutinising it from across the 3 states. So lots and lots of board meetings, let me tell you. So the Snowy story started back in 1949. The company turns 74 next month, actually. And it started, funnily enough, with nothing to do with electricity. It was a product of extended drought in what's known as the food bowl region of the East, which is the Murray-Darling Basin. You have a lot of farms there. Those farmers produce a lot of the wheat and rice that Australia consumed. They were facing extended droughts, which meant these farmers were failing, which meant the country was in pain. So the Australian government decided it needed to do something, and it needed to build an irrigation system that would ensure water was being stored when it rained and then being diverted to these farms in times of drought so that these farmers could produce food for the country. So that's how the Snowy Mountains scheme started, very much with a focus on water and a water licence. Now, to do that, they wanted to construct this ginormous pumped hydro scheme, what is still the most complex pumped hydro scheme in the world. And they worked out that they would need 100,000 people to do that. we didn't have 100,000 people with the right skills in Australia at the time. So they started a massive migration push. Now, this is just after World War II. It's also not long after the White Australia policy. And so the Australia of 1947, 1948 was obviously very different to what you see now. But the government decided that they would go out all around the world, predominantly to Europe, but also to parts of Asia, and of course to New Zealand. The last time I talked about this, there were two people in the audience whose grandparents had worked on the construction of the scheme. And they brought in an incredible 65,000, so nearly 2/3 of that workforce from overseas, representing over 30 countries. So if you go to Cooma in the Snowy Mountains, which is where the heart of our operations are, in the town square, there are flags flying representing all of the different countries that worked on the scheme, and it's pretty special. So they really started the new Australia, the face of the multicultural Australia, which was almost this wonderful byproduct that came along with the construction of the scheme. It wasn't all rosy, so 100,000 people worked on this, and there were 121 fatalities. You can see the people on the left-hand side of the screen. They're standing on a cliff face. That is an extremely steep cliff, minimal protection, minimal securing. You could argue that, well, that was just the way we did it back then, but that left a lot of scars on the psyche of this company. And we all hear about safety as the number one priority, right? It's true of most organisations, I think, construction, energy, etc. But for Snowy Hydro, it really, really is. Like you saw it in the way work is done. You see it in the way conversations are held between mates. No one ever wants to see what happened during construction happen again. And that underpins the culture within that company. So that was the Snowy of old, or what was called Snowy 1.0. What I'm really here to talk about is Snowy 2.0. So a quick snapshot. This is essentially the expansion of the pumped hydro scheme. That's what Snowy 2.0 represents. When it comes to fruition, it will add an extra 2,000 megawatts to the generating capacity of the scheme. For context, Snowy right now has 4,400. So this is essentially almost a 50% uplift. It can power 500,000 homes around Australia simultaneously. And it has created and continues to create thousands of jobs. It's essentially, if you look down the bottom here, it's connecting two reservoirs that already exist within the Snowy scheme. But it's connecting them by building a power station and tunnels completely underground, which is hugely complex, and it's doing it within the Kosciuszko National Park, a highly protected environmental area. And the shaft that takes you from the power station up to the reservoir is nearly vertical. So you can imagine some of the, the engineering challenges involved to do this are massive. On the right, you can see a diagram of where all of our different assets sit, and that red line is essentially Snowy 2.0. So in the scheme of things, in terms of footprint, very small, right? But the complexity and the environmental sensitivities mean that it has received a lot of attention, along with some of the other considerations that came into play. So how did we decide to build 2.0? Why did we decide to build 2.0? I talked at the start about the influx of renewable energy in Australia, which has largely been solar and wind. Batteries are starting to gain traction, but right now the pricing of batteries means we can't use them at scale and still be competitive, right? So there's still very much a focus on solar and wind, which is great, but you know what? The sun doesn't always shine and the wind doesn't always blow. And we saw that about 5 years ago in South Australia, which has moved pretty much to 100% renewable energy. We had a very cold, very wet winter. Demand was high, but because there wasn't any sun and wind, it couldn't supply its state. It couldn't supply its consumers, and they had rolling blackouts. So pumped hydro, which is essentially where you pump water uphill when you have plenty of it, you store it, and then you release it at times of need, is renewable energy that is firm. And by firm, it means it's available when you need it. So there was a growing need for this kind of energy in the market, given the changes that were happening around renewables. This was actually looked at back in the 1970s by the original architects of the Snowy scheme, but at the time the economics didn't make sense and construction was considered too complex. So they put it to bed. In 2016, the then CEO decided to revisit it given what was going on in the market. They pulled out those old plans from 1970s and then started their own sort of initial investigations. They felt it had enough weight that they wanted to conduct a feasibility study and went out in March 2017 to do that. Now, under our corporate governance structure, our board makes decisions, drives strategy. However, if there's a material change in the scale of the company, or if there's a material change in the operations of the company, we need to seek shareholder approval. So this obviously fit within that first one because you'd be lifting capacity by 50%. So we told our shareholders, which at the time were the Australian, New South Wales and Victorian governments, that this is something we wanted to do. Now, Australia has a federated model, right? So we've got the Liberals, which are right, far more right than your Nationals, and we have the Labor Party, which is left. And at the time, there were a mix of Liberal and Labor governments in play amongst our shareholders. Funnily enough, the Labor government wasn't as excited, and the Liberal government, the Australian Liberal government, was extremely excited. And the government at the time was led by Malcolm Turnbull. So the shareholders had their own side conversations, and the outcome of that was the Australian government said, you know what, we really want this to go ahead. And we want this to be the linchpin that underpins Australia's renewable transition. To make that happen, we're going to buy out the other shareholders because we don't want them holding up the process. And they came out and made that announcement 2 months after we said we would start a feasibility study. So we carried on, finished our feasibility study in December, saw that there was enough there that we decided to go through a more extensive business case assessment through to a final investment decision, which took us to the end of December 2018. In the meantime, the Australian government completed their purchase of Snowy Hydro, so we became 100% Commonwealth government-owned company. So still a company, but what was now known as a Commonwealth company, which in practice basically meant there were a lot more governance requirements and even more auditors that would come in, right? Otherwise, our operations largely remained unchanged. We got our environmental consents after many months of engagement with the authorities, and not long after we started construction. So this whole process took years: an exploratory assessment, a feasibility study, a final investment decision, a board committee that was set up purely to look at how this was running, a board that was supplemented with additional directors who had the right skills, and then seeking shareholder approval through our new shareholder. We became, as a Commonwealth company, we became subject to what's known as the Australian National Audit Office. I'm sure you guys have something similar here, but my take on it is they're the guys with the big stick that audit government departments, government-owned companies, can also go in and look at ministries. Their results are published on their website, tabled in Parliament, scrutinised by media. It's a great exercise, and anyone can write into them asking for anything to be audited, and they will then make a decision whether they do so or not. So they audited Snowy Hydro's governance and risk management of the project in 2021-22. And of the 85 audits they've done, this was the only audit that came back with no recommendations. So we essentially got a clean sheet. And they said, part of what they said was a comprehensive risk assessment process and effective governance. Now, I say this not to pat myself on the back, even though I know that's what it sounds like, but to point out that actually you can have the best processes, the best people, a checklist that gives you a clean sheet, and you can still screw things up. You can still miss things, because that's exactly what we did. So what did we identify as our top risks? Safety, for obvious reasons, and also partly because what we talked about right at the start around how much that is part of our ethos. But safety is a very real risk, right? The number one risk on this project is that someone could get killed. And so that needs to be managed. Construction and project delivery. This was a hugely complex project, hadn't been done in Australia for a very long time. We needed to look globally, and hydropower doesn't have a huge footprint. So there are very few people that can do it around the world. So identifying those individuals, working out how they would actually deliver such a project in Australia. So they were Italians, and what the interface would be between, say, our civil engineering works and our mechanical works, which would be provided by different players. Financials, obvious, so commercials, business case, NPV, potential cannibalisation of the broader company. Legal and regulatory delays, given what we were trying to do and the number of authorities we'd need to work with, trying to get everything in place, understanding what the impact of a delay would be on the overarching project deadline and what that would do to NPV, all those sorts of things. Contractor management, environmental compliance, that was massive, right? Because again, we were doing this in the Kosciuszko National Park. We would need to excavate, we would need to cut down trees. We would be working near waterways, and you don't want effluents or pollution going in there. So being very clear on what would be our environmental footprint, what biodiversity offsets would we have to play. Probably one of the most expensive risks to manage in the course of this project. Another one that was just below the top risks was around governance. So we recognised that we were doing something that we hadn't done for a very long time, that the board that we had at the time was fantastic, but did not have that mega project infrastructure experience. So we brought in an advisory council with those right skill sets, but we then worked to update our constitution to allow for a broader board, brought in some new directors, and then as director reappointments popped up, made sure that those directors had the right skills and experience, set up a project advisory committee that had oversight of the project, and did a whole bunch of things to make sure that we had customised what consultants would call fit for purpose governance over the project. However, what we did not talk about, what we did not bring up anywhere near the top 20 were social licence related risks. And I think there were two reasons for this. The first is we could see so clearly how good this would be for the country, how good this would be for the communities in which we operated. And we worked under an assumption that everyone could see it as clearly, right? So it wasn't recognised as something that needed communication, articulation, consultation. And I think secondly, Snowy Hydro has for a long time, until recently, had a culture of putting its head down and getting on with it, being a bit of a little engine that could. So you would see AGL and Origin Energy and all of the other private sector guys in the headlines. Snowy Hydro just did what it did, to the point where when I was interviewing for my role back in 2014, I'd been approached by an exec search firm and I was interviewing with the chief operating officer, a gentleman by the name of Roger Whitby. I thought, okay, well, I better do my research, find out who this guy is. I went to the website, I couldn't find anything. So then I Googled Roger Whitby Snowy Hydro, nothing. Then I Googled Roger Whitby Energy, found his bio, did my research, went into the interview. Turns out it was a completely different Roger Whitby who just happened to work in energy. But that was sort of the way Snowy had operated, right? We didn't publicise, we didn't do a bit, we didn't have a media team. Our comms were done by a small group of people who lived and worked in Cooma, because the comms we focused on were the comms with those communities, those remote areas, those power station workers, not the Fin Review, not the Daily Telegraph.
Would you say that that last one, environmental compliance, that was probably seen as if there's any source of social licence being undermined, it would be because we didn't think about the environment.
Absolutely.
Rather than just actually it's a risk in itself for
Yeah.
getting communities on board.
Absolutely. So I think if you think about it from the ESG perspective, and then you go reputational risk arising from ESG, it's very much the E and very much the G.
Yeah.
And that S piece and that sort of stakeholder understanding conversations just didn't happen. So you're right. Okay, so that's what we thought would happen, right? What actually happened? That change in ownership took up all of the oxygen. We announced our mind you, this is just a feasibility study after the 2 years of exploration in March 2017. In May 2017, Malcolm Turnbull announced that the Australian government would buy out the other shareholders. And all of the headlines that came about Malcolm Turnbull's pet project. So it stopped being seen as a project that had been scoped, costed, and undertaken by a company, and rather as a political plaything, right? And this was in energy was and still is highly politicised in Australia. Malcolm Turnbull, I'm sure many of you are aware, but was seen as a more progressive leader of the Liberal Party, and there were many within his own party who were not fans of renewable energy. And so this was seen not even as the Australian government's play, but as Malcolm's play. And unfortunately, what happened was not long after the Australian government purchased us, Malcolm Turnbull was deposed as the leader of the Liberal Party and therefore as Prime Minister. And with that came another layer of complexity that we hadn't foreseen, right? Because this was Malcolm's project. Well, Malcolm's gone now, so surely this project doesn't stack up anymore, can't wash its own face. And what we thought would happen, what we thought would be the narrative, disappeared. The public narrative went from a project that underpins the transition, a project that has had robust governance and due diligence, and a business that can just keep doing what it's doing because it makes good business sense to do this project, became very much about, what's the point of doing this? Why are we doing it? Isn't this just Malcolm's baby? And this is our money because we own you now. You're a completely Commonwealth-owned company, so this is taxpayer money. You need to tell us a lot more. Valid questions, but we were caught unaware, so we were unprepared. And I think with the public, once you lose control, you're always playing catch up. And it doesn't matter how much time and energy you invest in it. It is very hard to get back on the front foot. And bear in mind, this is why you're also trying to deliver a $5.5 billion project, right? So big learning for us. Because we'd always been owned by governments, we didn't appreciate the change that comes with being owned purely by the Australian government and the change in perception and expectations around what you as a company should then be doing. So we went from under the radar to being headlines and, talking points around the water cooler, and never for the right reasons. So we had the change in PM, which we talked about. COVID-19 hit about 4 months after we started construction. Now, our civil engineers, our primary engineers came from Italy, which at the time was a bit of an epicenter in Europe. And a lot of our mechanical equipment was coming from China, which obviously was being shut down. There were challenges around the delivery of the project, but more than that, it was safety. So we had all these guys that had moved across from Italy, gone to remote communities to work with them, but were now essentially being shunned because there was a lot of fear at the time, right? A lot of people that didn't fully understand, they didn't want to engage with them. And we were dealing with emotional and mental safety, well-being issues, but we were trying to deal with them remotely without actually being able to do what the plan was, which was to go and be in the community, support the community, build those bridges. The ageing electricity grid became a real issue. So transmission lines in Australia are well out of date and need significant upgrades to be able to facilitate renewable energy. So that was well known. What was not as well understood or not appreciated was to do these upgrades, you need to put up certain lines that might go over people's backyards, right? I say backyards, giant farms, not backyards that you can see from your house, but regardless. The cost of doing them underground would triple the cost of these transmission lines. So you might go from 5 billion to 15 billion in costs. There was an assumption that those who owned the lands, because previously they had been fine, those who owned the lands would be fine with these transmission upgrades being conducted and us being able to go over the top because they would understand that wasting $10 billion of taxpayer money wouldn't be the right outcome. Not at all the case. So This is not unique to Snowy Hydro. This is affecting Australia on multiple projects at the moment. There is so much community pushback on these upgrades and what these upgrades will mean for their homes, understandably, that those upgrades have basically stalled. And they stalled for Snowy, and that then added quite a significant amount of time to the project. And time costs money, right? So we kept going. The profit-making retail business, so Red Energy, as I said, right? Decency, customer satisfaction, great reputation. But suddenly, because we were Commonwealth owned, because we were a government business, there was a massive pushback against making money. So energy prices are high. Why is Red Energy making money? Why are you not a social retailer? You know, what gives you the right to take our money when you guys already have so much money? Performance incentive payments. So we compete with the private sector. We have traders, you know, we hire people from your Macquarie banks or your PwCs, or you need to compete, right? And so the scheme was salary plus short-term performance-based incentives, as is common in most private sector. Snowy Hydro came under huge scrutiny for actually having anything beyond a base pay. And there continues to be a push against incentives being paid to those that are essentially being deemed government employees. And that came off the back of a massive scandal around Australia Post. Is anyone familiar with the Cartier scandal? Yeah. So Australia Post is also owned by the government. Unlike Snowy Hydro, it doesn't compete with the private sector. It's essentially an oligopoly, a monopoly. But regardless, they have a similar system, right? They're a Commonwealth company. And they paid some of their executives, they gave some of their executives a bonus in the form of a 4K Cartier watch for meeting, I think something that saved Australia Post and therefore the government $400 million. And they gave out 5 Cartier watches, so 20K spent. But it's optics, right? It's perception, it's social expectations. It's this, we're struggling and you're sitting here handing out Cartier watches. And off the back of that, the push was so big that Snowy Hydro had to conduct a review of all of its gifts and benefits across 3,500 employees and present those results to a Senate estimates hearing, so parliamentary Senate estimates. We were clean, but it wasn't a fun experience. And that then really impacts culture, right? It impacts employees within the organisation. It impacts that sense of trust and buy-in that you've had for years. Because people feel like, well, hang on, I'm working harder than I've ever been working, and suddenly I'm being pinged on expenses. I'm being pinged on whether or not I deserve a bonus that I've already worked 12 months for. So there started to be a real shift within the organisation. Board appointments. So yes, we have an independent board of non-executive directors, but when you have a sole shareholder and that shareholder wants to put their own imprint on the company, it becomes more challenging. And from a governance perspective, it becomes really hard for directors to maintain that line and to be clear on what that line is around the best interests of the company, which is ultimately their main fiduciary duty. We're also blamed for the energy policy vacuum. So there has been a bit of a vacuum in Australia when it comes to all things policy. I think that's starting to shift now under the Labor government. But for a long time, there were no clear signals for private investment, and so private investment was stymied. And that, despite that having been the case for 8 years, that also became because of Snowy Hydro. So you can just see, right, the narrative is building on multiple fronts, and what started off, I think, as a lack of appreciation of the change in social license started to impact the company's reputation on multiple fronts, started to impact operations, started to impact employee engagement. As I said, I just want to be clear, this is not just Snowy. There is a broader issue around this, but to me, it all stems from how well we're managing the S in ESG within the energy industry. AGL, great example. AGL's CEO, chair, and half their board was essentially rolled by Mike Cannon-Brookes. Mike Cannon-Brookes is the co-CEO of Atlassian, so Australian homegrown tech bro turned climate activist, very, very active in the climate space and the green space. I think has great intentions, but essentially came in and said, AGL, you are one of the dirtiest companies in the world, quote unquote. What are you going to do about it? And AGL, I think, underestimated what they sort of treated him as this guy on Twitter who's got a loud voice, doesn't know what he's talking about, ignored it, just kept doing what they were doing, went down a certain path. And that momentum built and the noise built, and he essentially staged almost a coup, right? He tried for a takeover bid through Brookfield, so put something on the table which the AGL board rejected. So they then went onto the share register and silently bought up enough that they could influence the outcomes of the board. So the CEO stepped down, the chair stepped down, 3 of the directors stepped down, and Mike and his team essentially brought in 4 new directors, so enough for a majority, and they have completely changed their strategy. They were going to split into a clean company and a dirty company, and the dirty company was going to sort of decarbonise over a longer period of time. That's all been abandoned. They've had to completely change their strategy, and their brand has taken a massive hit in Australia. Origin Energy's not far behind. But I think as a whole, our industry underestimated how important it is to listen to our stakeholders, our broader stakeholders, not just our shareholders, and to respond proactively. So learnings, definitely stakeholder capitalism. So for so long, it's been all about the shareholder. It's been all about value creation for shareholder. I think more and more now, and it's great because I think sustainability is so important, but there is growing recognition of how important it is to listen to all your stakeholders. So those in your supply chain, your employees, your customers, Joe Public, who you may think has nothing to do with you day to day, but ultimately can have a big impact on your reputation. Understanding what they value, and then as risk professionals, being clear on the trade-offs, because you know what, you're never going to be able to keep everyone happy all the time. But if you're choosing to ignore or not respond to a stakeholder's needs, be clear on that and be clear on what the risk is in not doing that. S is absolutely not an HR thing. So often I think we hear S and we go, oh yeah, that's diversity, right? Yep, okay, that's equal pay. HR's got that. No, you've got to be having the conversations at the leadership table, the board, the executive. We need to define what S is. I think often it's uncomfortable because it's this qualitative, people think it's touchy-feely, you know, we can't really influence human rights. What's human rights for me as a company? So they leave it to HR, and I think that's really dangerous. We need to have the conversation exactly as we would around every other kind of risk that faces, around all of ESG risk. And it should be a standing item because ESG, but especially the S, is not static, it's not linear. It's changing and evolving all the time. So we need to keep it as a standing item on our agenda. When we talk about strategy and when we talk about risk, we absolutely need to be talking about ESG. Consultation is key. Our management team, fantastic team, but a team of people that had been part of the company for a long time. I was the newest and I'd been there probably 6 years at the time. Confirmation bias, right? And the biases that you don't even recognize. So we had a bubble and we had a degree of groupthink, positive groupthink, but regardless. And I think if we'd had some fresh voices, if we'd consulted more broadly, we would have been far more proactive much earlier in the piece. Employees are our biggest advocates. I think especially now in these times of remote and hybrid working, where they're having conversations that we're just not going to be part of, and they're engaging with people one-on-one. They can be our biggest advocates, but to do that, they need to be informed, they need to be empowered. So something I think we did really well at Snowy was keeping our employees informed and engaged. So we could sense when things were starting to shift, when I talked about the Cartier scandal. And they were such a great advocate for Snowy and for the facts. And given the geographic footprint that we had, you know, these remote communities and these areas which we just weren't able to get to for about 18 months because of COVID, they became one of our biggest champions. And I think there's that real opportunity when it comes to ESG with us. Don't make it an HR thing, but equally don't make it a management thing. Make it an all of company thing, because ultimately this goes to your corporate purpose, it goes to your corporate values, and your employees have just as much say in that as you do. Yeah, take your medicine, own it, don't spin, right? I mean, I just talked about purpose and values. If you spin, you lose all credibility. And to me, that is far worse than if you go, you know what, sorry, we got it wrong. This is what we should have done. And this is what we're going to do. And then you do it. I see so many examples in the corporate world where people try and spin their way out of an ESG story, be it greenwashing, be it social washing. And, you know, a lot of the time it is completely unintentional. But there seems to be a call being made that the risk of saying we got it wrong is worse than the risk of actually owning up. That press will disappear in 2 days. But you spin and you get caught further down track, you've trashed your reputation. And finally, scale up. So Snowy, as I said, prided itself on getting on with things, right? Prided itself on being very agile. The challenge with that is sometimes when you take on too much, something is going to slip through the cracks. So I went from being the head of compliance to the head of compliance and governance to becoming the chief risk and governance officer with responsibility for government relations. And I took that on right in the middle of COVID. So that was a fascinating learning curve, but that's a lot, right? And I wasn't unique in that. And we prided ourselves on that. We prided ourselves on growing our people and giving people opportunities. So that's fantastic. But you also need to scale up. Build for the company and the team you want to be in 2 years, not where you are now. And that comes with a cost. But if you believe you're going to be able to hit those goals, build that way because it will make your path so much easier. My personal learning, I mean, so I think these are all critical, but for me, the biggest learning, it's probably because I am a risk geek, set metrics. You mentioned earlier, David, you know, risk is becoming less and less qualitative, and you're absolutely right, but you still need to have metrics. If you don't measure it, you often don't do it. And I think that was one of the biggest things here, right? We didn't really sit down and say very clearly for ourselves. We did around the E, and E is very easy, especially now that there's regulation and there's reporting requirements. There's a clear stick, you know what you have to do. When it comes to S and to some degree the G, it's harder. And so we set goals, but we don't necessarily set metrics. And so we don't know when we've gone off piste until it's in the rearview mirror. So some of the work I'm doing now is very much around articulating what those metrics can look like in the social space. And then what for different organizations, that will be different, right? Depending on your purpose. So what does that look like? So that's very exciting. I think this is a hugely exciting space to be in. ESG or sustainability, or call it what you will, has almost become flavour of the year for the last 2 years, right? But it's been around for a really long time. I think it's now we're starting to see more and more appetite for it because, as I said at the start, there's more and more recognition of how important our broad stakeholder base is. So I'm really looking forward to seeing where this goes in New Zealand, but also just across the world in the next couple of years. Yeah, thank you. Thank you for letting me share my story. Any questions?
What's it like in Australia around this concept of greenwashing? So a lot of people got on board with ESG, they agree with it, they want to do the right thing, so they make some good statements. And now here there's a bit of a focus on, you haven't quite got it right, it's sort of focusing on almost the compliance of the stick, whilst not really encouraging the intent behind it. Is there something similar in Australia?
Yeah, it's a big issue in Australia. So the Australian Securities and Investments Commission, which is the primary financial services regulator, has launched a series of court cases against some of the biggest super funds, actually, because greenwashing has become so prevalent. Almost every entity is making statements around what's green. And I think it is important to encourage that intent, but you also want to maintain trust, right? You want consumers to feel like if a super fund says they don't invest in coal or they don't invest in gambling or whatever it may be, that they don't. So I think there's been such good intent, but I think at the end of the day, a business is about maximizing value as well, right? So I think in some cases we've seen companies jump on and perhaps not do the due diligence that was needed. Things have slipped through the cracks. The regulator's now taking action. I think we'll see a swing back towards the middle, but the mood there right now is very much around enforcement. Yeah.
I think it was a great story, and I think, in New Zealand, directors now being asked to focus more on stakeholder rather than just shareholder.
Yeah.
And I think, you know, in terms of interconnectivity, you know, social is a key receiver. So a lot of things that we control will exacerbate that risk, and then it comes back as an emitter to, you know, to potentially result in greater regulation and put a whole lot of brakes on strategy. So you did right. It's if it's treated as a silo, as an HR thing, similar to climate change risk at the moment, where the focus is more on the disclosure rather than on the strategic importance of these areas, then yeah, I think you're at risk of blindside.
Absolutely, very true.
So we've just got 2 comments, not questions. Very interesting and perceptive presentation. And I see a lot of links to health organisations from the lessons from Snowy. Second comment, yes, brilliant presentation with lots of good thoughtful points. Thank you.
Thank you, appreciate it.
I think, yeah, absolutely echo those. I think we've all got the challenge of the ESG journey, the challenges regarding greenwashing. I mean, even as an organisation, I work for a finance company, we're always going to finance vehicles that are not exactly healthy on the environment. We do our bit around EVs. We finance a lot of industries that are under a bit of scrutiny now, things like forestry and things like that. So I think we've got that challenge around what are those ESG statements look like that we can live by while being pretty realistic. The other thing is that social license, I think, is now sort of reaching out into other industries we probably never thought it did. I sit on a school board, and now the Ministry of Education has come out and said, when you do your strategic plan for the school, you've kind of thought you're all a school, you educate people and you're doing it well. Now it's no, you think about your social license, you need to go and engage people, and you need to go and engage communities, you need to engage iwi, and you know, so that whole social license is really moving across a number of industries. Look, really informative discussion, echo what the other comments are, some great insights, so thank you very much, Praveena. Please put your hands together. Look, it's been I hope you found that a really informative morning. I think a good variety of presentations there. Just a couple of things I want to point out. Just a reminder that we have a conference coming up in February. I think we sent out a save the date, 12th of February next year, with the theme of Embrace the Unknown, Unleashing the Power of Risk. We're just finalising a good lineup of speakers in the agenda. So once that's all out, we'll make sure that's circulated. And then just I'd like to say thanks to all the presenters. So David, Tammy and Praveena, thank you very much this morning. And thanks again to the KPMG team for making this all happen, and food and refreshments. And thank you to all of you attending and those online. I hope you all found it informative, and hopefully the technology worked and you could all hear and see the outcomes. So there is still some food and refreshments at the back, so please take the opportunity to